Until telegraph cables across Europe and America finally began to shrink it, the whole world felt inordinately vast. But one huge barrier to rapid global connection remained: the Atlantic Ocean. Before the cable, a letter could take 12 days to cross the Atlantic and weeks more for a reply. After the cable, continents reacted in minutes, and from that moment forwards, Europe and America stopped waiting for one another. In diplomacy, in the markets, and in the letters and messages of families, delay was no longer the default. In this series, we've been exploring how each new form of communication reshaped the modern world, and this was the moment that change became global. Once people had grown used to speed, slowness stopped feeling normal and became a bore. This is the story of how a fragile copper line was laid beneath the ocean and how it altered the relationship between continents forever. I'm Basil Valentine and this is The Shape of Now. If you enjoy our thoughtful storytelling about how the modern world came to be, please consider liking and subscribing. By the middle of the 19th century, telegraph wires were spreading rapidly across Britain, Europe and the United States. Indeed, from the late 1830s onwards, roughly 30,000 miles of copper wire had been strung across towns, cities and railway lines. News, diplomacy and even gossip now travelled at the speed of electricity. Only one part of the system remained stubbornly slow, and that was the vast Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, delays across the pond had simply been accepted. And then in 1851, a submarine cable was successfully laid beneath the English Channel, linking Britain and France. Once that had been achieved, the Atlantic no longer seemed unimaginable, only unfinished. Expectation, though, had begun to outrun infrastructure, and when that happens, pressure builds. The idea may feel inevitable to us now, but in the 1850s it still hovered somewhere between ambition and fantasy. The Atlantic was by no means a narrow stretch of water. It was 2,000 miles of uncertain depth, violent weather, and almost entirely unmapped seabed. This is where Frederick Newton Gisborne enters the story. Now, he was a self-taught electrical engineer, not a statesman or an industrial magnate, but a man who believed that two continents could be joined by a single line of copper. In the mid-1850s, he set out with a practical first step, attempting to connect New York to St. John's in Newfoundland by telegraph cable. But even that smaller leap proved punishing. Within 2 years, the cable he had bought in London had broken on a rocky seabed, and the overland sections he tried to push through were running into frozen wilderness, with cost and delay. By 1856, Gisborne was tens of thousands of dollars in debt and facing accusations of fraud. To some, he seemed like a visionary. To others, he appeared reckless. It's worth pausing here because innovation does often look like failure while it is still unfolding. The future doesn't always announce itself confidently. More often than not, it resembles a costly mistake. And by the middle of that decade, the dream of a transatlantic cable seemed very close to collapse. It was at this point in 1856 that another character enters the picture: Cyrus Westfield. Field was a paper manufacturer from New York in his mid-30s. He had no formal background in telegraphy and no experience of the ocean floor. What he possessed instead was conviction. Where Gisborne had struggled, Field saw scale. By the end of 1856, the line from New York to Newfoundland had been completed at a cost of around $1 million, an absolutely extraordinary sum for the time. Yet, even as that inland connection was finished, Field was already looking further outward. In 1857, he ordered roughly 22,000 miles of submarine cable from two British manufacturers. The quantity alone hints at the scale of his ambition. The cable was so heavy that it had to be divided between two warships, HMS Agamemnon and the USS Niagara, loaned by the British and American governments. This was no longer a private experiment. It had become a national infrastructure project supported on both sides of the Atlantic. There is something slightly unsettling in that certainty. Field believed not simply that the cable could be laid, but that it would be laid. The details, the unknown depths of the ocean, the stresses on the copper and iron, seemed secondary to the inevitability of the idea. But the Atlantic Ocean does not negotiate. On the first day at sea in 1857, the cable snapped. It was hauled back, repaired, and then it broke again. Hundreds of miles of iron and copper sank into darkness. Ambition had collided with physics, and a lot of money had been lost. Field tried again in May 1858. This time the strategy was different. The two ships would meet in the middle of the Atlantic, splice their cables together, and then steam in opposite directions, one towards Ireland and the other towards Newfoundland, laying the line as they went. Even that attempt failed. Storms engulfed the vessels, and the cable broke repeatedly under the strain. Investors began to lose patience at this point. The vision was persuasive, the public was ready, but the system itself was not yet reliable. And reliability is, in the end, the difference between spectacle and infrastructure. Yet Field refused to abandon the project. On July the 29th, 1858, the ship set sail once again. This time the weather was kinder, and on the 4th of August, the Niagara reached Newfoundland. The following day, HMS Agamemnon arrived in Ireland. Against expectation, the cable lay intact across the ocean floor. On the 16th of August that year, the very first official messages passed between Europe and America. They were filled with religious language and hopes of peace, and there was widespread belief that the world had entered a new era. Church bells rang out, flags were raised, and in New York a parade was held. Tiffany's even sold fragments of unused cable as jewellery, tiny relics of a connected future. But the signal itself was very weak. Queen Victoria's message to President Buchanan, fewer than 100 words, took 17 hours to transmit. By the 1st of September, the cable was sadly already faltering, and by late October 1858, it was dead. The miracle had lasted barely a month. Public celebration turned to accusation, and what seemed like the promise of unity was recast as financial folly. After the failure of 1858, enthusiasm waned. Another attempt faltered the following year, and for a time the appetite for such risk simply collapsed. For nearly 7 years, Cyrus Field was unable to mount a serious new effort. It might look in retrospect like a period of failure, but in reality it was a period of learning. In the early 1860s, telegraph cables had successfully been laid across the Mediterranean and through the Red Sea. Engineers refined their understanding of insulation, tension and signal strength. They learned how to handle immense weights of copper and iron with much greater discipline, and so transmission speeds improved, rising to around 8 words per minute. The earlier failures had exposed weaknesses, and those weaknesses were gradually addressed. In 1865, Field returned with a new plan and a new vessel, the Great Eastern, then the largest ship afloat. It was big enough to carry the entire cable in one continuous length, removing the need for a mid-ocean splice. Even then, the Atlantic Ocean asserted itself. After more than 1,000 miles had been laid, the cable snapped and disappeared into the depths once more. At that point, many investors believed the project was finished and simply bailed out. But Field did not share that view, and in July 1866 the Great Eastern sailed again. This time the cable held, and on July the 27th, 1866, Britain and North America were reconnected. This time there were no grand celebrations. What mattered most was that the line functioned consistently. By 1866, short messages could cross the Atlantic in minutes at speeds of several words a minute, rather than the days at sea of previous years. They could do so reliably, and they could do so day after day. With a reliable cable in place after 1866, the Atlantic no longer imposed the same pause on communications that it had for centuries. Governments in London and Washington could exchange instructions within minutes rather than waiting for ships to arrive. During conflicts such as the American Civil War, the delay between continents had shaped diplomacy and perception of how that war was progressing. That delay was now disappearing fast. Financial markets began reacting to developments across the ocean on the same day. At a time when London remained the financial heart of the world and political crises could spread with new speed, this was a tremendous advance. From that point onward, the United States was no longer informationally distant from European power centres. It was plugged directly into it. Public opinion, therefore, no longer developed in isolation. Events in one capital could influence another. Newspaper headlines travelled across the Atlantic before the moment had finally settled. For families divided by migration, the ocean no longer meant weeks of silence. A lot of people believed that faster communication would reduce conflict by removing misunderstanding. In practice, it allowed coordination to become more precise and reactions more immediate. Empires were able to manage distant territories more tightly, and alliances grew deeper and more interconnected. What emerged was not simply a working cable, but the beginnings of a transatlantic system. Europe and North America were now bound into a shared international framework, one that would increasingly shape finance, diplomacy, and eventually global influence, and one that continues to this day. Within a few years, submarine cables extended beyond the Atlantic, gradually wrapping the globe in the same copper wire that was used for the internet. Even today, much of the world's data still travels along cables resting on the ocean floor. Satellites, of course, play their part, but the backbone remains undersea. For the first time in history, continents were living within the same informational time zone. In this series, we've been tracing the moments when these new forms of communication changed not only how messages travelled, but how the world itself felt. The telegraph reduced distance dramatically. The transatlantic cable removed the pause between continents. Of course, the ocean still separated Europe and America geographically, but it no longer automatically meant long delays in communication. From that point on, the world began to operate at a shared pace, and once expectation adjusts to the new speed, it doesn't return to patience. In our upcoming episodes, we will continue to explore how each new development in communications increased that sense of connection until distance itself began to lose all authority. The 19th century internet was the cable system. I'm Basil Valentine, and this is The Shape of Now. If you enjoy our examination of how the modern world came to be the way it is, then do please consider subscribing, like this video, and join us as we continue the story further.